Hey, the African painted dog is one of the most beautiful animals I have seen in the wild. Their body's covered in patches of black and tan, and they actually do look like they were painted on with a brush. And they have these huge rounded ears and a furry white tipped tail. I am Marcia Sivek, and this is BeProvided Conservation Radio. My first sighting of these dogs in the wild was in Namibia at the Erindi Game Reserve. We were on safari and the gate opened to the natural area of the preserve, and there they were, a pile of black and tan spots, maybe 20 or so dogs. There were groups of them lying around on each other, some curled up, sleeping on others, and others laying on their backs with their legs up in the air, just like a house dog playing and enjoying time in the sun. They are social creatures, and I could tell they were both young and old dogs in the group, and they were all interacting with each other. And when seeing such playfulness, I almost felt like I could reach down and rub their bellies. And then one yawned, and that's when I saw the teeth, these large scissor-like molars, and I greatly appreciated I was safely sitting in a safari vehicle. They definitely demand respect. Listen to the high-pitched greeting sounds of these dogs as they greet each other. This audio and the video of these dogs is provided by the Endangered Wolf Center in St. Louis and can be seen at BeProvided.com. Well, as you may have figured out, today's show is about African painted dogs and the people working hard to educate the world of the importance of them and why these dogs need our help to survive. My guest today is Dr. Greg Rasmussen, founder of the Painted Dog Research Trust, and we tried to connect with Tammy Cloutier, a former PhD student of Dr. Greg's for the Painted Dog Research Trust, but unfortunately, the internet connection had a mind of its own. So I interviewed Tammy separately, so stay tuned for another episode with her experience and passion with working with the painted dogs. Before we lost connection with Tammy, I asked her how she got involved with the Painted Dog Research Trust, and Greg jumped in and gave his interpretation of the story.
She was flying over Zimbabwe, and the parachute went off, and she landed in a net in a painted dog. But Tammy, maybe that's not your story.
However Tammy got there, stay tuned for our next podcast episode with her and get the real scoop from her directly. As you may have noticed, Dr. Greg is a great storyteller. He has many stories to share, not only about painted dogs, but life and survival. He is the only person I know who has survived a plane crash in Africa or anywhere for that matter. So I jumped right in and asked him about his experience.
Well, that's a bit like jumping into a book in the middle. Trying to read, but yes, I mean, okay, let's put it this way. I started painting dogs 33 years ago.
Okay.
34 years ago, and I became absolutely passionate with them. And my whole life is and was then revolving around painted dogs, which meant radio tracking them. And in the early days, of course, I used to be using those old radio antennas that you'd walk around with a broomstick on a pole and a wire thing stuck out at the end of it. And trying to drive at the same time as hold that thing out of a moving vehicle was quite fun, to say the least. But anyway, I did that for a number of years, and then slowly but sure, when I started painting dogs, they were seen as vermin, like the wolf. They didn't have a friend in the world. And I mean it. They did not have. And so raising funds for painted dogs was like trying to raise funds for, rats or something, or aphids or something ridiculous. And so we struggled through, and then finally, anyway, tracking them, because they're such a wide-ranging species. I mean, they've got a territory that's something like 400 square miles. Wow. And in a day, they can be one end of the territory, and the next day, they're the other end of the territory. So the only reliable way to track them was by aeroplane. And for many, many years, we couldn't afford pilots. We couldn't afford to employ a pilot. We still can't, but we're using GPS collars now. And so finally, after about 10 years, I managed to save enough money for an experimental airplane. Put it that way. It wasn't one of your standard Super Cubs or Piper Cubs, but it got me up into the air. It got me high. It enabled me to track the dogs more reliably. And in the particular case, this is the crazy bit, was that plane time was always a problem for everybody. Anyone in wildlife conservation needed to get up in the air to find their animals when they get lost. And in this particular case, national parks had said we've had huge problems with poachers. We've got rhinos that we haven't seen, heard of. We've tried radio tracking. Or from the ground, we haven't found them for months. Could you put your plane up? And of course, I'm going to say yes. It's conservation. It's conservation. It's not just, no, sorry, you're a rhino. I can't help rhinos. I only help painted dogs. And so I took off at about 5 o'clock in the morning, because we used to take off really early when it was cool, basically, because planes we're quite high altitude anyway, which isn't the best flying conditions. And then when it gets hot and you're in a plane with not much lift ability, you're on a hiding to nothing. But anyways, I took off. I told everyone I should be back by about 10 or 11 o'clock maximum, the latest. If I'm not back by 10 or 11, start sending out the search party, because I had fuel for 4 hours. And I'd found the rhino by about 5:30 in the morning. And there was a cow and a calf. I was very excited. You have to go, and the thing is with bush piloting, you've got to go really low. So you go low and then you try to get out as quickly as possible. Well, on that particular day, there was an airflow that was just at the altitude, my low altitude, that tipped my wing and turned me into wing stall. And so I crashed the plane. I was, you're 1,000 feet above ground, but you haven't got enough time. There's no piloting in the world is going to get you out of the trouble. And so I crashed, and I didn't realize it when I crashed, because I don't have an X-ray machine on crash site, but I'd broken pretty much every bone in my body except my spine. And they're incredible. My God. My arms and my spine remained intact.
Wow.
And I'd broken my ribs, but my spine and my arm, my pelvis was broken, my legs were broken, but my arms and spine were the only things that were not broken. My femurs, tibs, fibs, bones in my feet, there was nothing from the impact. And so I was out there for about a day and a half until they finally found me. I mean, the sad thing is that I had a green and black plane. I might just as well have covered myself with camouflage netting and said, "Don't fight me."
Exactly.
The details. It looks great, a green and black bush plane, but I would have much rather had a bright orange one.
Are your planes now bright orange?
I don't fly anymore. We can't afford it, and there's no need. But and when I crashed, the emergency radio died on impact. So that was all my means of communication went out the window on impact. All the electrical circuits short circuited, and the emergency radio was fried. Wow. And so during that period, I was visited by a number of challenges. And in fact, people might think that wildlife theoretically was my biggest challenge.
Yeah, that's what
No, it wasn't.
No.
My biggest challenge was dying from loss of blood internally, because when you break a femur, you lose a liter of blood, and I'd broken 2. Wow. My biggest challenge was dehydration, because when you're flying for 4 hours, you don't carry a 10-liter water jug, because that makes the plane even heavier. Yeah. Makes it more likely to crash. So, yes, I did have lions and hyenas come around, but they, to me, were the least of my problem. My biggest problem was dehydration and having to know survival, just staying alive long enough. And there's all the survival in the world. Fortunately for me, I had done survival training in the past with the British Merchant Navy. It's amazing what you learn in life. You never realize when it's going to come back.
Yeah.
And one of the standard survival things is take one problem at a time and deal with it. You can't solve you can't multitask. Anyway, I'm a guy, so what can I do? Of course I can't. I can only solve one problem at a time. But that's the standard survival kind of manual. And it's true.
Yeah.
And my dealing with trying to maintain, more people die of like getting too frightened and scared, and then adrenaline and your heart rate goes mad, and before you know it, you've run out of oxygen,
right?
And you've sort of killed yourself. And so I did have lions coming and hyenas. The hyena scared me more than lions, actually, because hyena actually came. Well, it was just The hyena actually came around the back of me. The lion came around the front of me.
Mm.
And so the front, it's like you're facing it. But when you're paralyzed, you're totally paralyzed, and something's coming in from behind. And I had to judge exactly how far it was before I made a loud, explosive noise, which had to come from me smashing bits of plane, of which there were plenty, against other bits of plane.
Right.
But it's a trick that I learned as a kid when I used to be turning over rocks to look for lizards and snakes. And you get some little mouse or a shrew, and they go, psst, they can make us like, and they would do that, and you get a fright. Ah! If I come right up behind you, everyone jumps, and that jumping causes them to run adrenaline, and they run. But you can't do it too far away. You do it far away, they're like, oh, so what's that noise? It's not scary, it's not dangerous. And so that's how I got. And they found me then. Actually, I'd almost had to play every trick in the book to stay alive, because I was doing deep breathing to maximize my oxygen levels. I was covering my face with my hand to circulate the oxygen that I did have, because I knew that I was going to run short very quickly. And the moisture, importantly, the moisture.
Oh,
and the condensation, because you can lose your body fluid very fast by breathing. And then, in fact, that was a trick that I'd learned when I used to be really cold and sleeping in the bush, because when it was well, it was 0 Fahrenheit and below.
Wow.
Minus 17 centigrade. In some places in Zimbabwe, it gets like that. And I'd be so cold, and I'm like, well, I can't sleep, but I need to keep warm. And I circulate my breath to keep my mask and my face warm.
That's good to know.
And there are all sorts of tricks, things that came out of it, and deep breathing to monitor the pain. And that's what I did. I did the deep breathing that actually the women do when they're. I didn't go to prenatal labor classes because I never needed to. But it's the same stuff. Same thing, you know.
Did you have to keep yourself? Did you have to keep awake and kind of keep yourself going?
I was terrified to stay. I knew if I fell asleep, I was going. Well, I automatically would have switched off all my. I would have just dehydrated in my sleep. But the main thing was that what kept me alive, because I realized that it's quite easily to just say, you know what, I've had enough. and I realized I had some kind of quite cathartic moments that well, I realized then how you hear about the Aborigines or the Native Americans just say, we're done. We're going to go off, we're going to disappear, and we're going to die.
Yeah.
And at that point, I figured if I'd said, you know what, I've had enough. I'm just going to stop deep breathing and close my eyes. They'd have found me, and we wouldn't be talking today.
Yeah.
And I thought about it. I went through that whole, do I want to live? Do I want to die? You go through this whole procedure. And finally, I came up with, yes, I've had a good life. I've done lots of things. I've got no dependents. I haven't got any children to, to look after or a relationship. And one of my parents wasn't there anymore. One was, but, and then suddenly it was whole, but I've got so much more to do for conservation. And that was my adrenaline came in. And then there was the point where, and again, it's a sort of survival technique where you have to start lying to yourself that they're going to find you. Because the second you lose hope, and I knew I was lying to myself. Oh, they're going to find me.
It's probably easy to lose hope like that. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And every time I kept hearing the search and rescue planes come closer and then go farther away, I'm like, eh. And then I'd be lying to myself. So, well, they've seen me. They're coming in a minute. And if they didn't come in a minute, well, of course, they must have been far away, and they're really hard to get to me, and they've got to walk miles, and any old BS stories, And finally, they did, and actually, it was they didn't see the green and black plane because they couldn't find it because it was well camouflaged in the rocks. But I heard the plane, and as a final last-ditch effort, I was trying to use the strut as a heliograph to create a light.
Oh,
like, and that created a flash, and that flash, but they could only see that flash if the plane had to be at the right altitude at the right time of day. Because early morning you weren't going to see anything because the sun's angle was wrong. The sun angle had to be high, so they didn't find me till midday.
Wow.
And then once they found me, then well, the rest wasn't history actually, because the reality is that whilst the 24 hours was intense, the recovery was far greater.
Oh, yeah, that had to take probably years, or you're probably.
Well, it took years, but it's also the story of the teams that support you, the teams, the nurses, the doctors, the physios, your friends that came out of the woodworking. You're like, I never knew you were this much of a friend, but my God. Aren't I lucky, cross-pollination between the Zimbabwean teams that did, with very little resources, did amazing things.
Yeah.
And then there is the psychological, and how Zimbabwe really knew how to deal with the psychological challenges.
Yeah.
Far better actually than when I got to England. They didn't have their game on target.
Oh, interesting.
And so, well, quite often you see, it's like a friend of mine in the States a lot of it was like the rehab facility I went to was only for the real trauma. If you went in there with a broken finger, forget about it. You go and see a doctor.
Yeah.
Or don't bother don't bother us. We only deal with people who'd had severe crashes and were paralyzed, and they really understood the group therapy of patients getting together, but not like a group where you're saying, I have a problem, because we all have problems. But they get us all together drinking cups of tea and in the hydrotherapy pool. You were chucked in the hydrotherapy pool whether you needed it or not. But it was a great place where everyone would start communicating. And periodically, when someone felt the time was right to let it go, let some of that horrible stuff they'd let it go. But it was in an environment when they felt ready to. It wasn't like saying, now, Greg, what's your problem?
Right. Force you to talk. Yeah.
And then so that was very special, actually. And actually, so I was with, so I lived with disabled people for a long period. And in many ways, you understand another layer of, life. You're living as a disabled person.
A different perspective.
Another perspective.
Yeah. Well, since the show's about African painted dogs, we should probably continue talking about the dogs. And I am just so inspired by that survival story. I had to share that. And, so African painted dogs are native to sub-Saharan Africa and now live in small pockets, mostly in Zimbabwe, Botswana, and Namibia. Currently, there are they believe, fewer than 7,000 dogs left in the wild. And humans play a huge role in their decline.
In fact, the truth is human interactions are the biggest threat to 99.99% of all wildlife. Larger animals get hit harder because they're easier to target. And tragically, when you go back in history, canids, all the canid family, the wolves, dogs, painted dogs, they've all had a bigger rap. It's almost like this Red Riding Hood mentality. And in fact, when I started working with painted dogs in 1987, my first pack, 24 dogs, 20 were shot by ranchers. There was no empathy for painted dogs in the country. They'd been put on bounty. And in fact, wherever Europeans arrived, canids got the rap. Anyway, and so when I started, painted dogs were vermin right throughout the country. There'd been a bounty on the species, much the same as there'd been a bounty on the wolves that took the wolves to extirpation pretty much, and right across the states. The same mentality. I was dealing with ranchers of European descent that would mimic any of your ranchers that are currently shooting wolves. They were, in my term for them was redneck, and they were a bunch to be dealt with. And so it took me 13 years of working with them, and I used to continually work with these ranchers. Some of it was trying to change their minds, but the other thing was to get the initially the public was behind the ranchers, because whatever came out of the rancher's mouth was, oh, that's fact. That rancher says he's lost $200,000, whatever, some ridiculous number of cattle to painted dogs. Without, he wanted to justify the slaughter. It's a bit like if you don't like someone, you start making up. Some people make up stories about them that are not very pleasant. Liar, a thief, or whatever, and worse. And so I started realizing, saying to the farmer, well, why are you killing the dog? Oh, because they're killing cattle. So I said, well, let me find out. The whole thing, as a biologist, I work on fact, and I'm not really interested in much else, or at least enough data that points towards there is something going on. And so I said to the particular ranchers in question, I said, well, entente cordiale, I said, I want you to stop shooting dogs for 3 years. Oh, they're going to kill all our cows. I said, so I can study them. They said, why do you need to study them? We can give you the answers. I said, that's biased. And it turned out, and I said, but after 3 years, I said, I promise I'll move all those dogs out of the farmland. Because you have to have, anything has to be you can't have a one-sided argument on either side. Someone's got to walk away. And so I was going to walk away with studying for 3 years. And in that 3 years, I managed to get the real facts that painted dogs were responsible for 1.7% of all the farmers' losses were attributable to painted dogs.
What was the
1.7?
Oh my gosh!
I mean, like almost zero, but not quite. You know. And losses of cattle to management was about 50% of their losses. Bad management, straying cattle, you name it. Mm-hmm. Keep going. Bad cattle breaking their legs in cattle dips, and bad management over disease, and you name it. And anyway, so the dogs were the least of their problems. And in fact, 17% of the management losses were due to cattle swallowing rubbish, plastic bags, baler twine.
Oh my gosh!
Because there's one you keep animals, and in one case a cow died because he swallowed a shoe. Because once a cow starts eating something, he can't just like you and me put his hands up and
he has to
pull it. He just gags, basically. And so that caused 10 times more losses. Rubbish killed more cattle than painted, 10 times more cattle than painted dogs. And at the end of it, the whole data, it all came to the point where when I presented this to the ranchers, they said, well, we sort of knew that. I said, so why did I do the study? They said, well, we just don't like dogs. I said, well, maybe you started off with that, And it turned out that it was just prejudice, just absolute, it was just, it was no different to racial prejudice, only it was prejudice against wildlife species.
Throughout our conversation, painted dogs were often compared with wolves in the U.S. I was curious if painted dogs were ever revered as magical or spiritual to indigenous cultures.
Absolutely. It was really crazy. The indigenous African culture, when we looked right across, really dug deep, and you've got to talk to the old people, not the young people who, maybe been modernized sadly by the Europeans who actually were their conquerors, if you know what I mean, in those times, because they'd stolen their independence. And in one area they were a protector of the people, and then during drought years they believed that the dogs would provide them with meat because game animals, they chased game animals closer to the homesteads. True or not, but that's what they believed. Another group said, well, the dogs are fine because they help. If they kill something, we can't catch. We're not efficient hunters as them. And if we catch them killing an impala or a kudu or a wild animal that we can't catch, we can chase them off their kill. So we get free food. Then you had the hunter matabele, which are traditionally like hunters of wild game. And they used to say, well, these dogs are amazing. We like, wow, if we could capture their powers somehow, we will become better hunters. So it was completely the reverse. I mean, when the Europeans arrived, they were hell bent on getting every corner of Zimbabwe colonized by your own people, right? Well, I give you 10,000 acres or whatever I give you, or more, and say, here, take this parcel of land. And I go there and I say, I can't do anything here. There's wild animals, lions, and this. I can't have cattle or whatever, and the ground's no good for beef or for cropping. And so then the government, the then English government, British government said, don't worry, we'll set up a bounty scheme, and so you can earn money by killing predators. So they had huge amounts. I mean, this happened in South Africa. I mean, South Africa paid out in between 1910 and 1915, a figure of 0.4 of a million pounds of the money of the period. That would be today. That would be like 6 billion. It would have been ridiculous. Yeah. And it was only given. It wasn't. It in no way matched the damage being done by the predators. Mm-hmm. And if we're honest, dare I breach on U.S. soil? The bison weren't killed because of the railway.
Right.
They were killed to deny a population of their traditional food and everything else. And the predators were killed to make way for European expansion.
Conservation in general relies on education and public outreach in local communities as the key to success in saving an animal species. The Painted Dog Research Trust with Dr. Greg and his team is working hard to change the opinion of painted dogs from vermin to much-needed carnivores that help keep balance in African ecological systems.
Basically, we just slowly but surely, some of you might have heard the old adage, divide and rule. Mm-hmm. When you're trying to get your way. And so the first thing was to get the public not to believe the ranchers. And once I did the research, they didn't believe the ranchers anymore. And I was always honest in my findings. And then people started to trust me and said, well, ranchers were not behind you anymore. So suddenly they didn't have the mouthpiece. Yeah, and then I used to change the minds of the public by a radio program in those days. So we're on radio. It was a radio program, and it was called Wildlife Forum. And this guy would come out. He had a lovely, beautiful radio voice, and like silk.
Nice.
And he'd come out in January, and he would say, Greg, let's do the year's worth of Wildlife Forum once a month. And we would record over 2 or 3 days, a whole year worth of program, and then every month he'd be giving an update. Well, it's now February, and I'm back in Wangi National Park with Dr. It was brilliant, but he changed so many. He changed so many minds, and I did have ranchers call into the program and said that I was blasphemous and I was talking the work of the devil and all sorts of crazy things. But that's what he got. It never went on air. And slowly but surely, I had the public behind me, and the ranchers had lost their audience. And then slowly but surely, some of the ranchers, and I would go to every ranchers meeting, and some of the ranchers started to realize, after I'd really done all that work in their farmland, they realized, well, actually, it's prejudiced. We can't use the argument that it's killing cattle. And then it turned out that we had a prosecution that took me 2 years to get to the table. It took me 10 years to get government to be in a position to prosecute, and one rancher was prosecuted and given a sentence of 6 months in prison
for killing the dogs on his property.
By then it was illegal because of all the effort that I put in to get them into the right place.
Kudos
and that stopped it dead. Mm-hmm. That basically I read it like this. I might hate painted dogs if I'm a rancher, but I'm certainly not going to risk going to prison for that hatred.
Right.
If the dogs were causing me really genuinely tens of thousands of US dollars worth of loss, you break the law, wouldn't you? Mm-hmm. You'd say, look, I'm sorry, I can't not break the law.
Right.
But but when it's just prejudice, I just have to swallow it. And that's what happened. And then slowly but surely, ranchers, there were some ranchers that did change very meaningfully. and really realized that, you know what, we're barking up the wrong tree here, no pun intended. And so that was the rancher side of it, and that stopped. And so by 2013, the last painted dog was in Zimbabwe was shot.
Oh wow,
So that was,
that's that's great.
and
Yeah.
there's been none since. And and I don't think it's going to happen again. We're not going to see it again. And it's the only country, if I may say so, where such a feat's ever been pulled off. But it took 13 years. It's a big time slot. So that was, you know. And then you think, oh, I've solved that problem. And then of course there are always other emerging problems, threats, poachers' snares that are set for bushmeat and not set for painted dogs. More recently, which is where Tammy comes in, we've got two emerging threats. The big one is wildlife tourism at dens, taking dogs to where they have their pups, and the impacts are immense. You know,
So
behavioral changes, the pup,
oh
and then the dogs change their behavior. I mean, the behavior so that they don't get fed properly, and they're not socially interacting. You know, let's face it. If I suddenly come and sit in your living room, you know, and you can't escape, and you can't chase me away.
yeah,
You won't be in your living room for very long. You know, you'll
right.
just be out of sight. And there are just so many. And then eventually the dogs have to make the hard decision. I shouldn't be moving because it's dangerous to move with my babies, but I don't know how dangerous. It's all about what we call perceived threat.
Mm-hmm.
Then they try and say, look, the alpha female makes the decision. I need to move my kids to a safer place because I don't know what's going on here, day in, day out. And my pups
Yeah,
aren't getting fed properly, and then they lose them to other predators on the moves. So
crazy.
whereas it's in an undisturbed den, it's uncommon for a pack to lose even one pup.
Oh really? High
Oh,
survivor. Oh, that's great.
very high, very
Yeah.
high, very high, because they put lots of babysitters. But also the thing is when people are at the den, they don't feel safe to leave too many babysitters, or maybe they leave more babysitters when they go hunting, but then they've got less hunters. It just messes up the whole dynamics.
Wow.
And it actually, in the long term, which is one thing Tammy was looking at, messes around with the growth pattern at that very early age. And they have very set growth patterns. And they have to grow really long legs very fast because at 12 weeks, they've got to go nomadic. And if your legs aren't long enough, so they're designed to be like these, almost a bit like, you know, the seabirds. That, you know, you hear about these Arctic birds that
Oh,
they've got a very short winter. And that winter means that they've got to feed those chicks. Those chicks have got to fledge super fast
mm-hmm.
before the big freeze sets in. And they've got to feed them so much food that they're growing like mushrooms. Well, painted dogs are exactly the same. Very high metabolisms. And at 12 weeks, they go nomadic, and they might be doing 10 to 20. They can be doing up to 10 miles a day.
As you heard, these dogs are traveling huge ranges, 10 to 20 miles a day. And as Greg mentioned, the adults will travel with pups, and the whole pack will work together to guard and nurse the younger ones, kind of like babysitters. And, the packs do not like to leave individuals behind. A great example of such a story is best told by Dr. Greg.
The first thing that struck me about the painted dogs is I was on my own now working with painted dogs. So the reason I was taken on because I'd had lots of field experience with the naturalist museums. Because all my whole life I worked helping out naturalist museums where I could. And I knew nothing about dogs. What struck me forcibly was that here I was as a young biologist then, and I had no idea that the species was so close to being extinct. And I thought, blimey, it's not like some little earthworm, or this is a big mammal. And no one was aware. There was no awareness about this. And all there was a bunch of, what was written about painted dogs in those days, there was no real data. 90% of what was written, was just BS, and nothing was true. And of course they were labeled as savage, ruthless killers. All those horrible expletives that are total rubbish. And there were a couple of game-changing incidents. And okay, initially I just used to follow a pack, and wherever they stepped, I would sleep. And if I lost them, I'd find them again and catch up with them a few days later. on those occasions, I started to notice these amazing greeting ceremonies, which was quite special, and the way the pack sleeps in like a big dog heap. They pile themselves up in a heap, and you think it's ridiculous, but it's bonding. It's like bonding, and then the one dog is to sound happy. But then there was the game-changing moment when I was following a pack on an evening hunt, and I suddenly hear this huge dog-lion interaction, and I'm like, oh, this doesn't sound good. Someone's got hurt. And anyway, when I finally got my vehicle to the place where all the sound was coming from, there was a dog lying on the ground, and he couldn't move, and he'd been, grabbed by the neck and given a good mauling and a good shaking. And the lion had moved off a bit, and I got out and I drove the car up to the dog, and I don't know where the lion was now, but the lion obviously felt he'd done his job and killed the dog. And I looked at this dog, and the dog couldn't lift his head. And we all know that when an animal's injured, you can't even. And there was that glazed look in the eyes. I'm like, anyway, so I contacted the vet. The vet said, "Look, there's nothing. It's nature." Well, it is and it isn't. We can talk about that for another hour, but I'm not going there. And so the next morning I came back, and sure enough, the dog was missing because I was assuming. But there was a drag mark. So I assumed that hyenas had come and picked up the carcass. And that was it. And then I saw the pack the next day, and there was 11, and now there was 10. And then there was one dog in the pack, a very special dog to me. His name was Circus. And we're writing another, not with Tammy, with another author, we're writing a children's book about Circus, which is great.
Oh, cool.
And he was also one of my special dogs. There's always some special ones in your study. And Circus kept disappearing in the morning, somewhere around 9 o'clock, because the pack, they hunt from about 5 in the morning till 9 o'clock. They're crepuscular. They hunt in that twilight zone, and then a little bit into when it gets lighter, and morning and evening. And Circus kept disappearing. And I'm like, where's he going? So one day I said, I've got to find out where he's going. He didn't have a collar on. And so one day my curiosity just got the better of me. And I got a tracker with me. I said, the next time Circus goes, we are going, because normally for tracking, you work in twos. You don't track on your own. You track in twos, and it's faster.
Okay.
And so we walked for about 3 or 4 miles, something like that. And we get to a point, and lying at that point was Ulna, Circus's brother, the dog that I thought was dead.
Oh, wow. Was it alive?
He wasn't dead.
Oh.
He was alive, and Circus had been going back every single day to feed his brother and clean his wounds.
Oh, my gosh.
And here was a savage, ruthless killer.
Yeah.
And it was the first example of a species taking care of its sick.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah.
And it turned out later, I realized that it wasn't a singular event. Painted dogs do it all the time. They look after old, they look after their sick. And then I find out more likely that, different dogs take on the role of being doc. It's unbelievable. Yeah. And then it was interesting. I told that story because I always vowed that when I was doing these radio programs, I was never going to say anything that I'd read out of a book in case it was. I would tell everyone exactly what I knew to be facts. And I kept it that way, even though sometimes I might have to repeat myself because I was limited in my, but and I told that story, and I used to tell that story because it was fact. Something I'd actually done.
Yeah.
And you know what was really bizarre was that years later, as I was at a farmers meeting, and they wanted me to do a presentation, like a conservation type presentation. And the farmer said to me, you must tell that story about Ulna, that dog Ulna. And I'm like, he even remembered the name of the dog.
Doesn't it seem like we as humans can learn a lot from these painted dogs in regards to social interactions and behavior? I would think so.
My God, their social system is, in my mind, is as close to perfect as perfect can get. They don't have egos. They don't have dominance hierarchies. You have the alpha pair that run the pack. And then they've got the betas and the gammas. But Every dog is treated equally. Now, a gamma dog, you might say, well, is that the runt of the litter? It might be the runt of the litter, but they don't treat him differently. They don't leave him behind. Every dog shares the food equally. If there's 100 pounds of meat on the table, and there's 10 dogs, each dog will get 10 pounds. And even if a dog's late and comes late, they'll say, "Oh, here's your share." They run the pack by consensus. All these things that we keep hearing, that this is the way we maybe should be moving.
Yeah.
There's no one saying you do what you're told, otherwise you'll get a slap in the.
Right.
And that's why I never use the word dominant. They're not dominant, because ultimately a dominant animal, at the end of the day, violence is the final weapon, isn't it?
Yeah.
And they don't act like that. The alphas, are, and in fact the alphas are chosen by the pack, the siblings. So in other words, if you've got 5 brothers and 5 sisters in a litter, for argument's sake, when they start in their first year, all the siblings are watching the other sibling, their other equal sex sibling. And there's always a natural alpha, the one that's slightly more bold, slightly more curious, and all the other puppies are in awe of this dog, and that will be their leader. Fighting in painted dogs is so rare as almost to be non-existent.
Really? Okay.
It happens, and what the triggers are, we don't really understand. But there's not this territorial battle. They respect each other's territories. They have signposts where they let each other know where they're all at from time to time.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't go and wait at a signpost, say when they come, we're going to, hound them down. And, it's very rare. I mean, it happens, but it is so rare as to be non-existent. And so, and then they have this every single day when they wake up, every dog greets every other dog.
Really?
So it's literally a proper. I don't just say hello everybody. I will go and, in dog language, shake hands or kiss every member of the audience.
Oh, that's great.
Right?
So do they just touch nozzles, or do they
anything?
Talk,
it's a bit of everything. It's maybe just a body swipe. It may be just it happens so fast. To analyze that alone, particularly if there was 20 dogs, the number of interactions would be 19 plus 18 plus 17 plus 16, because that's
all,
it's not one dog saying hello everybody. And you may say, well, what's that all about? But you see, the thing with painted dogs is, in fact, in my PhD, I nailed it down as, and it was accepted by my examiner as, preemptive conflict resolution. So basically, by being nice to each other all the time, be fair. If I say good morning to everybody, and then later in the day I'm a bit grumpy, mm-hmm. I'm more likely to be, the grump can be accepted. The apology's already happened in the morning.
Yeah.
Good morning, Marcia. Here's your cup of coffee. Later on, oops, I've just dropped the coffee cup on the floor and smashed it all over your carpet. I'm more likely.
But you're forgiven because you're nice to me and brought it.
Because preemptively, building up brownie, and decisions are group decisions.
That's great.
They have a quorum. Yeah. And alphas. This is one of the things in zoos. It's very hard sometimes for the keepers to see who the true alpha is, because obviously you've got but because alphas in the wild also often, I've seen them exhibit submissive behavior, because I'm just saying sorry, Marcia. To do that, I've got to,
Yeah.
It's not just I'm the alpha, I can just tell you any old thing, and no, I'll say sorry. Yeah. If sorry means going into a submissive posture, that's what I do. Doesn't matter what my rank or status is,
That's impressive.
And they work for the common good, and they only have 1 litter a year, and each pack has 1 litter, and every dog, all the sisters and the brothers and last year's pups, all help raise that one. They put all their investment into raising that 1 litter, and they all protect them exactly like their own. And the whole pack is given full privilege to, interact with the pups whenever they want.
That's great. How many pups usually in a litter do they have?
Well, it's interesting. Nature's far smarter than we are. If pack size is small, which actually predicts that they're unable to raise large numbers of pups, they have few pups. Pack size, let's face it. If you've got a big pack that's going out hunting, and each dog can eat 20 pounds of meat, which they can, by the way.
Wow.
You can bring a lot of food back to raise the pups, right? Yeah. If it was just you and me, we can only carry back a little amount of food. We can't raise them now. But what's interesting is they're not born. It's not interesting. It's almost intuitive sense, because a female in a small pack is probably not as well fed as a female in a big pack. So she's not in the same body condition. So therefore she has. So small packs might only have 2, 3s, and 4s. Big packs can have up to 15, 16, 17 pups.
Why is she smaller in a small pack? You'd think she'd be bigger.
No, she's less well fed. I mean,
less well fed. Okay.
Because the hunting success of 3 dogs is nothing like the hunting success of 13 dogs.
Okay, that makes sense.
It's a bit like on a football field. If there were 3 of us trying to play football against each other, we'd spend more energy just running around the pitch than ever kicking the ball.
Exactly. The ball has a lot of ways to go. So, that's interesting. So there's a lot us humans could learn from these dogs and animals in general.
I wish we would, because, I mean, animals in general. I mean, painted dogs are another one. They people used to say, oh, they just wipe out their prey. No, they don't. They move around and take the sick and the weak here, and then I'll go another 10 miles and I'll take a sick and weak one there. And that's why they have such a big territory that's exclusively theirs, pretty much. Is they're not exploiting their habitat. And even, when I was analyzing my data for my PhD, there was some fascinating little nuggets that came out. Was that painted dogs only ever kill an animal if they can eat the whole thing in one sitting.
Oh, really? Okay. So they don't want to waste.
Because 2 painted dogs can kill a huge kudu bull that weighs, 500 pounds or whatever they weigh, right? They won't go for it. They'll leave it on the hoof for tomorrow. Because tomorrow they might have 20 pups and they need 500 pounds of meat to feed the little suckers,
Exactly.
They never go for bigger prey than they need, even though they're very efficient. And 2 dogs can kill a very large animal because they use the same technique wolves can't do this trick. They use the same technique as humans do with horses and bulls. They grab them by the nose, which restrains them. No, it doesn't actually.
I thought it did. Okay.
No, I know. See, there again, it was a vet that did some good science. I love people who do good science, and get rid of the myths.
Yeah, because I didn't know that.
When they grab them by the nose, there's a trigeminal nerve that goes very close to the brain, and it releases endorphins. So almost like they're on just had a morphine shot, and they just go into a state known as catatonia, and they just stand there, and they're easy then to finish off in less than 60 seconds.
Wow. Okay.
So they don't struggle. They don't actually even feel anything. And I actually know that feeling, because when I smashed my plane, for the first 5 minutes, I didn't feel any pain. Yeah, you hear about it, but it's a fact. Your body has released all sorts of wonderful chemicals and drugs
to help you out. Well, do cats do that too? Like lions do that. I've heard of lions doing that to animals. They go and they kind of put their mouth over their nose.
They're trying to suffocate, but painted dogs haven't got a. They just bite the nose.
So the sound you hear is of the painted dog's signature who call. And yes, you do hear wolves. You're not going crazy. There are wolves howling in the background. That is because this audio was provided by the Endangered Wolf Center in St. Louis, where they also have wolves. So I asked Greg a little bit more about the painted dog communication skills before I let him go.
Well, painted dogs actually have a huge vocal repertoire that they use for both long distance and short distance. And the short distance is very high frequency, which means that they can communicate but no one can hear them. And if you're right there, you can hear it. But if you start driving the car like even 100 yards away, you can't hear a thing. It's amazing. It's brilliant. So it means that then they're not alerting all the lions and the hyenas. Here we are. And particularly, they like thick bush more than anything. And then they've got, actually, it's a fun story because it's one of my, I had a young graduate student with me many years ago, and her name was Simone Hartwig, and she was wanting to do a PhD, and she said, Greg, I want to do a PhD on dogs. And I said, well, why don't you study the who call? The who call is this long-range call that the painted dogs use when they're lost or in distress. But interestingly, only one dog seems to do it most of the time. They do have a who call. They have actually a group who call when they lose a pack member and they know he's dead.
Oh,
and then they go into this almost like unison, ooh, and they're all in pure harmony.
So is that like a morning
It's the most
process?
haunting. There is, you know, and it's not being anthropomorphic. You know, the more we see it, you know, the more you realize this. And also ultimately, it's just our human arrogance that, you know, only we humans have emotion. You know, come on. Anyone ever looked at their dog when you come home? You know. That's the given, isn't it? And then actually she said, why the who call? And I said, well, I tried in the early days, you see, playing back the who call of painted dogs, hoping they would come out of the bush so that I could fit radio collars or see them, but they were so elusive. And I used to drive around Wangi National Park with this big speaker on the truck of my roof, playing woo woo woo. For all, you know, of calls that we'd recorded. Yeah. And I never ever had any response. And then one day I looked at the pack and I'm like, right, I'm now going to play because I want to see what you should be doing when you're close enough to hear this rubbish I've been playing for weeks. And of course, no surprises. Everyone was saying Greg's going out with his ice cream van again, you know, ice cream van good with his jingles, you know. The dogs sort of looked at me and lifted their head and put their heads back down again. Anyway, so I said to Simone, I'm like, right, we need to know more about this. So she took it on and she said, what, a whole thesis on the who call? Well, it turned out to be fascinating. And that's the lovely thing about science. You know, you can take things deeper and deeper. Well, it turned out that when she analyzed the who call is something like, ooh, 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 ooh. And always at the end, it sounded like they'd run out of breath. And it turned out when she analyzed that last, ooh, that was the signature of who they were.
Oh, interesting. So they all have their own little signature who.
At the end.
So,
Greg. So I was playing, and I realized then I was doomed, and the only time they'll ever respond is that when dog is dead or lost. Wow. Then they'll respond to anything. So if I'm playing a who call to a pack of dogs in front of me, and then maybe I'm playing a who call and there's a dog, if he's unfortunate, called Greg in the back, right? They're going, well, Greg's right beside me. What's that idiot doing playing his rubbish music? If it was another pack I was playing, they're not territorial, so they don't immediately all get up and go to battle. Yeah, they're like, okay, well, it's not my dog, you know, the old Woody Allen, you know, it's not my dog sketch, you know. I mean, it was just. Then I realized, you know, and you start to realize, and we still have really got nowhere to understanding the higher level of their communication, but they blow me away. In the field, you know, like I've worked with them for many years, and you know, periodically, you do certain things and you start hearing a noise from the dogs that you've never heard before. And it's not like it's like there's a whole language there that's unbelievable. I remember we were preparing some dogs had been dug out of a den by ranchers, and we decided, and the adults had been killed, and the pups, we were raising the pups in the rehab facility that I built in Wangi. And so the mission was always to rewild them, get them back into the wild whenever that opportunity arose. And to learn how to try to get dogs back into the wild. Could it be done? What steps were needed? And we got these dogs in a sort of fenced reserve that was big enough for them to hunt freely, so that there were two females that had learned to hunt freely. And then at the last minute, they were meant to go straight from there to their release side. But then at the last minute, there was a hiccup in some bureau. There's always this bureaucratic paperwork that held it up and meant they had to go back into the rehab center, which we'd didn't want. And as we got the dogs back into the rehab facility where there are other dogs. And these dogs communicated with the others like for over an hour and a half.
Oh, wow.
It was like they were telling a whole story about their last 3 months.
It
was unbelievable.
Oh, that's great.
It was unbelievable. I'd never heard anything, and it wasn't like a monotone. It was like blah, blah, blah. It was I was mind blown, and and I'd never had a recorder, but of course you never do when you at the right moment to capture that high quality sound for analysis. You really, and anyway, it's like a foreign language, and analyzing wildlife language is very tough.
Oh, I bet.
But there's stuff going on that in the dogs that is just mind blowing.
So as you can tell, the Painted Dog Research Trust has a lot going on. And if you haven't heard of the Painted Dog Research Trust, please check it out at paintedDogResearch.org. And as you can tell, Greg has a lot going on, and he has the energy and passion to keep it going forward. And the world, I think, is a good place with people like him helping our wildlife.
There's a lot of things going on all the time. I mean, like just when you solve one problem, like in this case, the ranchers, I mean, now we've got problems with human den disturbance, for tourism. Our biggest current threat is road traffic accidents, cars, high-speed cars.
Oh, wow.
And of course, and as the century progresses, motor vehicles are plowing along through wildlife areas at speeds in vehicles that have got, you couldn't even get that speed 20 years ago. And, sadly, we've got programs that spend their life promoting speed, which drive me mad, and we've got petrol heads all over the place. I mean, in my current area, my sole threat, my biggest singular threat are vehicles.
Wow.
And they have systematically on one section, it's a 50-mile section of road, 40-mile section of road, have systematically wiped out every single pack every year for the last 5 years.
Oh my gosh. And that's detrimental when there's only what?
So
2,000 dogs left or something?
But maybe 3, maybe 4, but in Africa.
Wow.
And the problem is so now we're working on it.
Yeah.
Really hard to try to change human minds and get laws in place, and you know what the sad thing is I realize that to get petrol heads drivers to really change their behavior is going to be harder than getting redneck ranchers to change theirs. It's that sad. And let me tell you, and these are roads public access roads running through wildlife areas. And you hear it every now and then, a government in country X wants to put a public access road through, whether it's the Serengeti or the big national parks that and the wildlife people are going up in arms because that's the death of wildlife. It really is, because it basically, it's a highway, and it's a high-speed highway, and even if you put speed limits on it, no one takes a toss. And managing those speed limits is not easy. You can't have cameras in a wildlife area every mile like you do in England or something like that. You can't have it. And wildlife authorities can't afford the high-tech speed cameras anyway. Yeah. So we're trying to develop low-tech speed cameras that will monitor over bigger distances. But then, of course, we have to get police involved. We have to get government involved. We have Ministry of Roads involved. And it's like trying to, get a bunch of cats to agree on a point,
I was gonna say that's got to be one of the biggest issues, is making sure that these people are ticketed or punished in some way. But is there any way to do any road signs? I know some petrol heads won't pay attention to it, but like slow down, painted dog area, or some people will pay attention to that. But
well, some people will, but and the fact is, we put a pile of road signs up last year, just making sure that year before last, because last year was a washout because of COVID.
Right.
And we put the speed signs up so that no one could say that they didn't know the speed was like 86, 48 kilometers 48 miles an hour,
Right.
50 miles an hour. But everyone was doing, 60, 70, 80 miles an hour and more, even in trucks, big trucks, which couldn't stop. And a number of our signs were disappeared because we have what you don't have in the state. We have elephants, and they were pulling them all down.
I didn't even think of that.
So then we tried putting barbed wire around them, but some elephants still decided that barbed wire wrapped around the pole was still
just a new
a
challenge.
challenge to be met, a new challenge.
Oh,
so we had all our signs. We had all our signs looking like big lollipops, all sitting on the ground.
I never thought of that challenge. And there's no way to. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. But
and that's why you can't put some of those things like barriers.
Yeah.
You can't put a barrier because the elephants will have a new challenge, and all they'll provide is loads and loads of fencing that the poachers, the wire will be used by poachers, and there'll be even more damage.
Yeah.
And then there are, as you say, overpasses. Well,
yeah, I was going to say
no one in Africa is going to.
Yeah.
Some overpasses. Who's going to build an overpass for a herd of elephants to cross?
Right.
One thing being a little bridge for wolves and coyotes and elk. That's one thing. But a herd of 50 or 100 elephants is a challenge. But
a lot of heavy weight load too. But that's really challenging. So you are limited to catching these people and getting police involved and.
Well, yeah, we are. We're going through that process, but trying to bring all the stakeholders together. I'm not that they're against it. They're just somehow. It's just you try and say, well, I've done my bit, and now you have got to do your bit now, and you contact someone else who doesn't do his bit, and it's like a broken chain, isn't it? So, but we are working on it. We're, and interestingly, we've done the social science with drivers, and as cleverly as we could ask the questions and find out, they all know what they should be doing. They all know that they should be slowing down when they see wildlife. They should be reporting. They should be, but no one. So everyone knows exactly what they should be. So it's not an education thing.
Right.
It's a thing of I want to do my thing, and I want to get there 5 minutes earlier or 10 minutes earlier. And unfortunately, the only solution to that is for us to start getting the police involved.
Yeah.
And what we're looking at doing is this average speed trapping. They use it in Australia. They use it in England in some areas where, and because it's far less invasive anyway, where they take, and in our case, we've got to trying to develop something. We've got to get average speed. Then you contact all these big companies that make this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But because I'm not UK government with taxpayers' money, where I've got a budget, they don't even answer you. Yeah. What's that? There's no money in that. The guy, if we're lucky, he's got $20,000. We're looking to $220,000.
Yeah.
And the government will say that's fine. Oh yes, well, what does it cost? 200. Oh, that's fine because it's government money. It's not my money. And they're all saying yes, yes, yes. And so and we're trying very hard to engage the tech world to help us. Mm-hmm. And in fact, Tammy's partner is trying to see what he can come up with, and we're trying to get along the way to give the police a tool that's very effective and reliable, but it's very low cost.
Yeah. That
we could raise the money for.
Yeah.
If you're raising a couple of $1,000s, it's fine. A donor would happily say, well, if you could stop killing of wildlife for $2,000 or $5,000 with pleasure, I'd love it. Mm-hmm. And if it's a system we could roll out elsewhere, which is going to rely on, taking a picture at the beginning and a picture at the end and the time at the beginning to the second, linked to a cell phone tower, so that, you can say, no, I didn't. You can say, well, is that you?
Yeah.
Yes. Is that you? And was that you at 18:05 and 30 seconds? Or was that you at, 18:35 and 40 seconds? And a system like that, if we can pull it off, and it is something that the technical world, the people we used to call geeks many years ago, but now there's a term of endearment, isn't it?
Yeah.
If the techies, the right techie could nail this in 6 months and provide a tool that we could dish out to show it works and dish out to enforcement units, to parks authorities. When, we say, here, take it, use it, enjoy it. Because then no one's going to argue. There's none of this, oh, but your radar gun wasn't working properly. Yeah. No, you passed this camera at 1830. You passed that camera at 1840, and the time signal was synchronized to the same cell tower. So you can't.
You can't.
No get out of jail free on that one.
So, techies out there listening, if you have a passion for conservation and want to help, maybe there's some technology that you can create or invent to help in Greg's endeavors to save more wildlife from becoming roadkill. If you do, contact the Painted Dog Research Trust, and I'm sure he'd be happy to take any help he can get. So I know this has been a longer than normal podcast episode, and I still wanted to end my podcast by asking Greg what gives him hope.
Well, what I always say is that periodically in conservation, you have successes. And I always say I take those successes as my light, my candle, through the dark until the next one.
This concludes today's show. I am Marcia Sivek, and this is BeProvided Conservation Radio. Please check out the Painted Dog Research Trust and Greg's work at www.painteddogresearch.org. There you can read more about the dogs and the research being done to save them. Also, check out their YouTube channel where they have a 3-part video series of Operation Anne, a painted pup rescue mission. It's a great, interesting success story. Stay tuned to learn more about Tammy Cloutier's work with the Painted Dog Research Trust and what she's doing creatively to bring awareness to people about our wildlife. The audio of the dogs doing their who call and greeting call was provided by the Endangered Wolf Center in St. Louis, Missouri. The videos also provided by the Endangered Wolf Center of these beautiful animals are on my website at BeProvided.com. And these videos show some of the interaction and communication of the dogs that Greg spoke about. In one video, you can hear the wolves, as we mentioned earlier, in the background. Not sure if they were reacting to the who call of the dogs or the dogs were reacting to the howls of the wolves. Intro music is licensed from soundstripe.com and is called Kilimanjaro Trek by Scott Horton. Thanks so much for listening, and stay safe and stay healthy.